So welcome everybody. I'm Ingrid Barker. I'm the chair of Gloucestershire Health and Care NHS Foundation Trust. I'm chairing this morning's session and we will be kicking off in just a moment or two, but we're waiting for people who are still arriving on the session. So just bear with us for a moment or two. That would be great. Thank you. Okay, I think maybe we might be ready to make a start now. So welcome back for everyone that's been in the conference already over the last couple of days. Welcome to those of you that are joining us for the first time for this NHS Providers Governance and Quality Conference. So I hope those of you that have been with us already are enjoying the sessions and finding them useful, and you will already know the drill. But first, today we've got our speaker, Professor Ivo Vlaev. Welcome, Ivo. Ivo is the Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School at the University of Warwick, and he's going to be speaking to us about cognitive bias and how leaders can minimise its impact. You'll see from the speaker profiles online that Ivo has a long track record in research in decision science and behavioural change, and he's co-authored an important report called Mindspace, which has been used by policymakers to make sure that their policies use the latest insights from behavioural sciences. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you, Ivo. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, for the lovely introduction of my modest persona. And yes, I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist helping people make better decisions and change their behavior. So sometimes I need to actually manipulate people for a living. Behavioral economics is the science of human decision-making, describing how people actually make their decisions. So cognitive bias in decision-making can have far-reaching negative impacts, as we might hear from me today, and show you some examples. Boards and managers need to be aware of the likelihood of cognitive bias affecting their thinking, and you need to be proactive in ensuring bias has minimal impact on your decision-making. This session identifies different types of cognitive bias and describes techniques to avoid and mitigate decision biases. So I have more content than there is time to present today, but do not worry. This is done on purpose because you can get my slides like a mini textbook and learn in your spare time. I want to make you a supercomputer so you could not have stone unturned on the pathway to find the optimal decisions in your daily profession. And so the title is Cognitive Bias, but I want you to be aware that behavioral science, which studies human choice, is extremely popular nowadays. There are numerous behavioral insights teams across governments around the world. This is from OECD report in 2018. There are more than 200 government units around the world having their own behavioral insights teams, and they're private organizations, also public organizations, NGO, having behavioral units, helping them make better decisions and optimize policy making and the impact of policy. Extremely burgeoning field. Behavioral teams grow like mushrooms around the world. So maybe you might consider having your own behavioral officer at home, Chief Behavioral Officer, CBO, in addition to CEO or Chief Financial Officer. So what have you learned in the last 50 years of research in behavioral economics in a nutshell, and after 3 Nobel Prizes in behavioral economics? So first of all, Herbert Simon coined the term bounded rationality in the 70s. He discovered people are boundedly rational, not perfect computers. They don't have the time and the resource to integrate all available information to make optimal decisions, so they satisfy, make just about good enough decisions. in the current situation. Then in 2002, Danny Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in economics for discovering the specific ways in which we are biased in our decisions, the specific ways in which we are constrained in our decision making. He discovered the specific heuristics and biases in the brain. Then in 2017, Richard Taylor received the Nobel Prize for incorporating the psychology of human decision-making into policy-making, and also for discovering and proposing the so-called nudge theory, how we can use this science of human choice, the science about the biases people are subjected to in their choices, to actually influence people, to improve policy-making. So it's very, very popular nowadays to work with behavioral sciences. So how the brain works, what is the toy model of the mind? I want to present this model so you can actually understand where the idea of bias originates from in our science of the mind. So what we discovered in psychology for the last 50 years is that there are two different ways of thinking, two different types of processes in the brain, two different systems in the brain in the way they process information. The system 2, which is slow, reflective, requires a lot of attention and is effortful. And then we also have this kind of system 1 thinking, which is automatic and very fast and effortless and doesn't require any voluntary control. And that's why we see Homer Simpson, this hapless creature who is always victim of his very human and fallible brain. Quick decision maker. And also system 2 is this reflective, evolutionary later developed part of our brains, which is like Mr. Spock, who is a Vulcan, omnipotent creature from Star Trek, who always makes the optimal decisions, always calculates the best course of action. So what happens in reality when you see a piece of information and you recognize this information in the environment, it quickly triggers this automatic process and you make a snap decision. Actually happens most of the time, turns out. But when the information is not recognized, the situation is novel and the stakes are very high, we engage our reflective and slow processing and make decisions. But you can see there's only 1 hour from the slow system and 4 hours from the fast system, which tells you that, well, 80% of human decisions are actually automatic, and only 20% are reflective. And of course, the two systems override each other and compete with each other in the decision-making process. Of course, if you repeat something several times, it becomes suddenly automatic. It becomes like a mental habit. So there is the interactive division of labor of two different ways of thinking. So system 1 is fast and uses the so-called heuristics to make choices. A heuristic is a cognitive mental shortcut used to solve a particular problem. It's a quick, informal, and intuitive algorithm our brains are using to generate an approximate answer to a reasoning question, right? Sometimes these heuristics can lead to optimal decisions resulting from their appropriate use. And most of the time, it turns out nowadays, these heuristics can lead to biases, the systematic and predictable errors in decisions resulting from the inappropriate use of heuristics. So for the most part, these heuristics are helpful because they allow us to quickly make sense of complex environment. But there are times when they fail at making a correct assessment of the world. When our heuristics fail to produce a correct answer, it can sometimes result in a cognitive bias, which is the tendency to draw an incorrect conclusion in a certain circumstances based on cognitive factors. So for example, people tend to use the availability heuristic to assess the probability of an event by the ease with which instances or occurrences can be brought to mind. For the most part, this is sensible since it is often easier to recall things that are more common or probable, right? To access them in memory. However, this isn't always the case. An event whose instance is more easily retrieved is not always going to be more probable. This mismatch between our judgment and reality results in a bias in our decision making. Now, we know the theory. Let's look at examples. So there are numerous biases in medical decision-making. There are two systematic reviews of the literature you can see on the screen here, summarizing all this evidence, how biased decision-making can affect healthcare, health-related decisions, medical decision-making. And you can see the list of various biases that we discovered in the literature and already been proven to affect clinical judgments and decisions. So I'm going to go to each of these, well, not to each, but to some of these biases and present the bias and give you an example how it works and how you can overcome it, how you can correct for the bias, how you can debias yourself. Let's look at the loss aversion bias. Now, loss aversion bias in medical decision making, this is the tendency to prefer avoiding losses than acquiring gains of the same amount. The opportunity to gain something is highly pleasurable, but the fear of losing something is emotionally more intense and provokes strong negative feelings in our brains, in our minds. So here is an example how loss aversion affects clinical decisions. In this case, they gave the physicians a specific scenario. Physicians were asked to read about a new asthma medicine. Clinical data shows that the new drug leads to significant reduction in both daytime and nighttime symptoms, as well as improved lung function. The trial also showed some reports of serious exacerbations leading to emergency care visits in the first few weeks of the use of the drug. So different groups are presented with the results, statistical results of the trials in two different formats. In one group, the data were positively or gain framed in terms of 95% of patients were not hospitalized with exacerbations during the first month of therapy. Another group of physicians received the data negatively framed or loss framed. 5% of patients were hospitalized with exacerbations during the first month of therapy. The information is the same. If 95% are not hospitalized, that means 5% are hospitalized. Well, when they asked the question on a scale from 1 to 10, low to high, what is your enthusiasm for adopting the new medicine? The first group said 6.5 average rating. The second group, 4.7, significantly lower, right? That's really interesting. Information is the same. These are physicians who should know how to make good decisions, who should know that 95% not hospitalized means that 5% are hospitalized. But no, they're affected by the frame because loss aversion affected their enthusiasm. The word loss, the word hospitalization, the word damage actually affects our enthusiasm for the action that it results in this outcome. So how can debias this decision making? Well, you could reframe it. If you see that the information is presented in terms of losses, then present the information in terms of gains, what you can gain from acting or what you can gain from not acting in a specific way, and vice versa. Or in best way, you actually present both frames, the gain frame, positively framing the information, and the loss frame, negatively framing the information. We can debias or bias our judgments by positive and negative frames and trigger or try to avoid loss aversion bias. Another bias is the anchoring bias. So anchoring bias is the tendency to be influenced by initial item of information, the anchor. A suggested answer serves as an anchor. We stay close to this number or opinion and only make brief adjustments when coming to our answer. In a way, this number lurks in the background of our minds and we cannot avoid taking it into account in our decision making. Here's a good example. Physicians, again, are asked to imagine that they have decided to prescribe a new serotonin reuptake inhibitor to a patient, antidepressant. And the patient tells you that he is concerned about the side effect of nausea. Now, in one scenario, the physicians asked and informed that the patient claims to have been told by one of his friends, a random person, that only around 3% of the new patients experience nausea when starting this medicine. He asked the physician how likely is that he will have nausea when he starts the treatment. Another group of physicians were told that the patient claims to have been told by one of his mates that around 90% of the new patients experience nausea. And again, ask what is the likelihood of nausea when it starts. Now, this is completely random information. Why would you care what the mate of your patient told them about the probability of side effects? I mean, you're the physician, right? You're the psychiatrist prescribing the antidepressant. Well, when asked what percentage likelihood they'll tell the patient, the physicians in the first scenario told them 12%. And in the second scenario, the clinicians told 29%. Well, almost double. The real answer is between 15 and 25%, depending on brand and dose of this drug. So imagine how this bias might influence the patient adherence, and this physician should know the answer. So what can we do to avoid the anchoring bias? So one technique that's being widely used is called consider the opposite argument to reduce the impact of anchoring. Consider the opposite. You argue purposefully in the opposite direction to actually avoid the impact of this bias. And this famous experiment, actually in old Western Germany, very famous study, they asked people to estimate the value of a car. And they asked them in two different frames. First question to our first group of people was, I thought that the car should sell about 5,000 marks. What would you estimate is the value of this car? And then the second group of people asked the question by starting with the statement, I thought that the car should sell for about 2,800 marks. What would your estimate be of the value of the car? The anchor is high in the first group, 5,000 mark. The anchor is low in the second group, 2,800 marks. And of course, you can imagine the judgments of these punters trying to buy a car much higher when the random anchor was higher. 5,000 marks, they offered 3,563 marks. When the anchor was low, they offered 2,520 marks. Well, now, another group of participants are actually given this, consider the opposite argument, the devil advocate. They thought that a friend of mine mentioned yesterday that he thought this value is too high, and the value is 5,000 mark. What would you say argues against this price? The group who were given the low anchor are told that a friend of mine mentioned yesterday that he thought this value is too low. What would you say argues against this price? And then they argued for a half a second, and then they're given the answers, 3,100 and 2,700. So you can see the discrepancy, the effect of the anchor is significantly reduced now when you consider the opposite. Another use of consider the opposite is when we're actually trying to reduce the overestimation in estimates of probability. So what you see in this graph, when you ask clinicians to estimate the probability of the diagnosis being true, of two different diagnoses being true, given what symptoms the informed patient presents, clinicians significantly overestimate specific diagnoses. And but weather forecasters are much more correct. They're well calibrated because they receive frequent feedback. This is the reason why they do so. So there is on the column is actual probability. There always predicted probability, and as you can see, that clinicians way overestimate compared to the true probability, and this is due often to the effect of anchoring and what they can remember for a specific condition is the probability, and then. But when they ask to consider the opposite, to argue for and against a specific hypothesis or diagnosis in terms of is it A or B, right reasons for A against A, and then right reasons for B and against B. So they have to write reasons for and against each of their hypotheses, each of their diagnoses for A and for B. Consider how certain you are in your judgments. Rate how strong each reason is on a 7-point scale. This difference between clinicians and weather forecasters is evaporated. There is no difference. We have to explicitly try to argue against our first idea, our first hypothesis. You have to write a bunch of reasons for your estimate and a bunch of reasons against your estimate. And this works really well. Also consider the opposite is being used in organizations to encourage constructive debate. These are a list of ideas and techniques that have been proven to work really well to reduce the effect of this bias. For example, to play the devil's advocate. And also try to hear everyone out in your team, starting with the juniors. Juniors usually stay quiet and they don't voice their opinion when it's against the grain, when it's against the majority opinion, especially when you start with a more senior person in the group. What the juniors used to do in boards, won't tend to do in teams, they tend to repeat the opinion of the senior person who voiced themselves before that. So what can you do is start with the juniors and start with people who actually voice their dissent and you think they have a different opinion. So here's a very famous statement from Eric Schmidt, who used to be the CEO of Google, on encouraging debate. You have to have a dissent. You don't have dissent when you have a king If you don't have a dissent, you have a king. And the new model of governance is very much counter that. What I try to do in meetings is to find the people who have not spoken, who often are the ones who are afraid to speak out, but have a dissenting opinion. I get them to say what they really think, and that promotes discussion, and the right thing happens. Another heuristic is the overconfidence bias that affects managers strongly, impacts quality of their judgments. Overconfidence bias is when people are overconfident about the likelihood of good events occurring or their own ability, including the accuracy of their judgments. It's very familiar bias. So to avoid this bias, a firm, Clifford Chance, adopted new procedure for hiring young analysts and new employees. It's a CV blind policy to break the Oxbridge recruitment bias. They used to recruit only from Oxbridge, and as a result, they might just miss on some really high quality candidates from different universities. So now universities urge employers to follow Clifford Chance's lead to find the best graduate candidates. So staff conducting the interviews are no longer given any information about which university candidates attend, or whether they can come from state or independent schools. And as a result, the quality of the candidates increased in Clifford Chance, and also other companies adopting this policy. All they're given is the name for the final assessment. And as you can see, graduates are delighted. So are blind auditions a good idea? What do you think when you're recruiting artists for the opera or for theater? To avoid overconfidence bias. So this type of audition process began changing in the 90s. So instead of seeing the artist performing live in front of you, they put the artists behind shades, so they cannot see specific features of their appearance, of their looks, their dress, of their mannerisms. And physical screens were increasingly being used since then to conceal the candidate's identity and ensure impartiality. As a result of this policy, there was an increase by 50% of the probability that a woman will be advanced from preliminary rounds in selection. And that increased by several-fold the likelihood of a woman to be selected in the final round, which reduced the gender bias in recruitment and promotion. Trying to blind yourself. And also, what we found is that the different ways to make people more consistent in their forecast to avoid the overconfidence bias. So this is a very famous example. A weight judging competition was carried out at the annual show of the West England Fatstock and poetry exhibition at Plymouth. This is old example from actually the 19th century. So people are asked to judge the weight of a cow, and the median guess was around 1,207 pounds, right? Random people select and say, judge the weight of this animal. The correct weight was 1,198 pounds. They're literally the same. The average was correct. And this is described in the very famous book, The Wisdom of Crowds. So what you can do to maximize the accuracy of your judgments is average forecasts from different people in your team. So you have different forecasters in your team and who might be overconfident, so they have some kind of error in their judgments. But when you average across different people, the average, the true value is in the middle. Why this is the case? Average forecast is almost always better than the best forecaster alone. We know that. This is because the best people are not consistently better. They're not consistent. We underestimate the power of averaging and we overestimate the experts. So best if we pick the top 5 experts in our teams and take their average forecasts. Another example of averaging performing better than individual judgments. Who Wants to Be Millionaire? We're all familiar with that show, right? So there's a quiz, and if you don't know the answer to the question, you're allowed to ask the audience or phone a friend. So when the participants are allowed to phone a friend, 65% of the time, they find the correct answer. When they ask the audience, 91% of the time, they find the correct answer. Why is that the case? Audience is almost always correct. If there is a signal in the crowd, it will come through when you ask large enough group. That's the evidence. You can also ask within yourself, like create a mental crowd by asking yourself first, what is the answer to this question? And then after delay, you can ask yourself again. So in this famous experiment, the participants are asked to make a forecast. And then unexpectedly, 3 weeks later, they asked the same question. So they forgot what the original answer was. And as you can see on the graph, the mean square error was significantly reduced. Now, first forecast is always better. It's usually better. Delay makes people more like independent observations. So these are different types of questions from the World Fact Book of CIA. For example, what percentage of the world airports are in the US? The reason this strategy works is because our responses are based on probabilistic representations or probabilistic distribution from which we draw our answers. They're not like fixed answers in our heads or memory. We always tend to draw answer from a distribution in our head. And for that reason, we tend to make probabilistic judgments which will vary over time. This technique, asking yourself twice, also works if you intentionally generate two answers. And if the second answer is different from the first answer. This is a specific technique. It has been proposed that several biases in our judgment result from a failure to consider possibilities at odds with beliefs and perceptions of the moment. Individuals who are induced to consider the opposite, therefore, should display less bias in their judgments. And in this case, first you have to generate a prediction or a judgment. Then you have to assume that your first estimate is off the mark. Then you have to think a few reasons why that could be. You just purposefully assume that your first answer, your first estimate is off the mark. Then you have to think why this could be. And then you have to ask yourself, what do these new reasons or considerations imply for your first estimate? And then after that, using this dialectical challenging yourself, your first estimate, then you have to make a second alternative estimate. And you can see here in the graph that this dialectical approach led to significant accuracy gain compared to the just repeating yourself twice, making a judgment on the same question. Of course, the dialectical approach is still worse than when you ask several people to generate answers to your question, other persons. Then there's a massive accuracy gain, but you can try to ask the crowd within your mind to produce answers several times. The wisdom of your mental crowd works, and trying to challenge your first estimate. Now, there's a simple decision tree here, how you can generate the second answer, and you can use the decision tree to produce your second answer, to either ask the wisdom of crowds when the estimates of other people are available, or you can blind yourself to your previous estimate and then wait a few weeks or a few days and ask yourself again. Or if you cannot blind yourself to your first decision, then you can use the dialectical bootstrapping, play your own devil's advocate, challenge your first assumptions, your first answer, and produce a second answer after that. Now, another bias is the confirmation bias. This is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, or recall information in a way that confirms or supports your prior beliefs or values. We're all familiar with the confirmation bias. You selectively look for information that confirms your original beliefs. And this is a very interesting experiment showing that people are inconsistent in their judgment because they overemphasize salient but uninformative events that support their original beliefs. So parole commissioners, as you might know, are asked to use their subjective instinct or gut to make decisions on the release of life sentence and public protection sentence prisoners. So usually they ask questions about psychological history, searching for telling detail or clue to convince themselves that the prisoner is no longer a threat to society. And when you ask parole commissioners how they make their judgments, they say, you look in their eyes, you can feel, you know if they're being sincere or not, and you can learn to see right through them. So as you can see, commissioners tend to search for, interpret, and favor information in a way that might confirm their prior beliefs or values. So here's the quality of their decision. There is a review of 64 studies, 25,000 prisoners involved. The most valid predictor was past criminal history. The least valid predictor was judgment by parole commissioner. Judgment was worse when the commissioner had opportunity to interview prisoners, believe it or not. So even use objective information, past criminal history, and blind yourself who this person is. Don't ask them questions, don't see them. You're much more accurate when you actually have the opportunity to see the person, talk to the person, and make subjective judgment. So why the prediction is so bad? Well, very simply, why? Because we have several factors that can influence our decisions. We take into account several features, and some are more valid in a given situations, and others are not so valid. And people might get these factors right, whether it's a past criminal history, or the way they speak, or the education, or the family upbringing, or whatever. But they don't use them consistently in different situations. Certain aspects of the specific context make specific predictors or factors more or less salient, and we take only these ones into account and ignore others. Maybe the way that the prisoner or the person you're talking to appears in front of you, the way they speak, the way their mannerisms are, and so on. So how to make forecasts more consistent in such situations to overcome this bias? We need to use data-driven approach. Suppose you want to predict job performance for new employees. There are at least two ways of coming up with a prediction. You can use your intuitive predictions. We ask an experienced manager to come up with a prediction, or you can use multiple regression. Very famous statistical technique is used on data. We have data on traits, for example, experience or grades of our employee, and job performance, sales, or whatever your job performance is. And then what we need to do is use the experience and the grades, the traits of this employee to predict their job performance. The linear regression will come up with a coefficient, the weight, the importance of each of these features of the employee, the experience or the grades in this example, to predict the job performance. And what we can do when you have a new employee, well, you use the new employee experience and grades, the specific features, and you multiply them by the coefficients that you infer from the linear regression. And that will give you prediction of their likely job performance. And you can see in this example, very simple linear statistical model actually outperforms intuitive judgments in various domains of life, like academic performance of graduate students, life expectancy of cancer patients, when I ask clinicians to make a prediction of the life expectancy of cancer patients versus actually using objective criteria in a statistical model, linear regression, to predict this likelihood. Massive difference in terms of the correlation of the predicted output with the real occurrence of this case. Business failures, mental illness, and personality tests, changes in stock prices, and many other results. You can see massively outperforms if you use statistical model, very objective model, and ignore your intuitive judgment. You can also use bootstrapping. Suppose you only have data on new employees and their predicted job performance, predicted by an experienced manager, right? So you don't have any historical data. You only have the predictions of an experienced manager, given what we know objectively about these people, experience and grades. Then we can improve our judgment by estimating a regression model with the predicted job performance as a dependent variable and use the estimated equation for prediction of new employees. So for example, you know the grades and experience of some employees, but you don't know their job performance. The intuitive prediction of an experienced manager tells you what the likely job performance might be. You fit a regression model to this data, and when the new employee candidate turns up, use the regression coefficients for experience and grades and plug in the values for this new employee in this regression. That will give you a job performance prediction. And you can see in the data here, typical results from bootstrapping studies in terms of correlation with the outcome, it always outperforms intuitive prediction. So it often pays to replace the judge with his or her own model. And so very simple linear statistical model works really well. Experts also use a simple linear model. They know the important domains, but they apply it inconsistently. So it's best to bootstrap and extract experts' theories. Now, we can use this model consistently when we have a regression model. So the key lesson here for you is that this works because by fitting a linear model to your predictions, I'm removing the noise. So if you're influenced by certain cases, individuals, for example, this influence will be removed by the regression after averaging across all your predictions and employees. So it pays to replace a judge by a model based on their theory, because just influenced by what is salient. So we can actually collect information about the importance predictors from experts, but then we use a model, a statistical model, to generate the predictions. So there is also another way to debias people in this way. For example, we can reduce confirmation bias in emergency room decisions. The doctors have to make a choice whether to place a new patient in a coronary care unit or monitor the patient using nursing bed. So clinicians may search for or interpret and favor information in a way that confirms their prior beliefs or values, which introduces noise and hence inconsistency in their judgments whether to place the patient in a coronary care unit or a monitor bed. And then the false positive rate is increased. As you can see in this diagram, the sensitivity, the proportion of correctly assigned patients is relatively high by physicians, but also the false positive rate is also high. So what can we do here to minimize the false positive rate? These are proportions of patients incorrectly assigned. So the proportion of patients correctly assigned, also proportion of patients is incorrectly assigned in many situations. So we can use very simple decision tree, simple to understand, simple to remember, and simple to apply. Simple decision tree can actually outperform intuitive judgments by clinicians, whether to admit to the coronary care unit. We can see here the fast and frugal heuristic that we use here can debias physicians, so we minimize the false positive rate, the proportion of patients incorrectly assigned, and improve the sensitivity, the proportion of patients correctly assigned. Or the other ways to reduce confirmation bias is checklists, because when clinicians and surgeons enter the surgical theater, they have the assumption that everything is fine, and they selectively look for information that everything is okay in the surgical setting, and that might bias their judgment. Surgeons might selectively search for, interpret, and favor information in a way that confirms their beliefs that the surgery will proceed well and they have everything they needed to succeed. So that's not the case. And when you ask them to actually use a simple checklist, as you know, the surgical checklist, that minimizes the error in their decisions. So we have a few other heuristics that I can present to you, but I leave that for you to read in your spare time, like the representativeness heuristic and several techniques that we can use to minimize the effect of the representativeness heuristics, which again uses formulaic approach in which you actually don't use your intuitive judgment of this specific case, but you compare with a reference class of similar projects like that and try objectively to take the outsider view when you judge the likelihood of a specific project successful and challenge your estimates. That's a good example that this works to forecast the success of business enterprises. and also default bias, which I'm sure you know already. So here we go. The various techniques that you can use to improve decision making and avoid bias. Average forecast, making sure that the average predictions from different judges, including average different judgments by yourself on different time occasions. Use a model, even simple model works. Avoid the information that can bias you, and then consider the opposite. Compare with a reference class, and use simple, consistent evaluation procedures recommended for ages. Benjamin Franklin used to challenge himself by writing the pros and the cons against every judgment he made. And in this case, he arrived at optimal decision. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Ivo. I reckon you might find your book selling out rather more. That was really fascinating. It'd be great at some point to have a kind of toolbox for managers and clinicians that, you know, give us a kind of noddy guide to daily use of some of these techniques, because they're clearly applicable, and you've given us examples across clinical, HR, business decision making, risk and judgment, and yeah, really fascinating. There are some questions in the question and answer. One of them from Sedi, and I think Mustafa has also come in on this one, about using some of these techniques to address the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda around HR and recruitment particularly. Have you got any comments or reflections on how these methods could be used in that arena more?
Well, when we talk to recruitment, I did mention how we can actually debias ourselves objectively when you're trying to recruit new candidates. The first technique that I mentioned was avoid specific information that can bias you. In this case, maybe avoid interviews. If you can avoid interviews, or minimize the impact of the way that interviews play in your judgment whether to hire somebody. There's plenty of evidence that interviews are a waste of time. And using objective criteria based on CV, as I said, job performance criteria that actually are statistically proven to predict whether a candidate can do well or not so well at work, are much better ways to actually use in your decision to hire or not to hire a new candidate. So avoid specific information that can bias you. For example, ask maybe candidates not to write down their names in their CV. So maybe there's evidence that the specific name that signifies the person is from an ethnic minority has been shown to affect the likelihood to hire this person, given that the CVs are matched in terms of quality of the candidate compared to somebody who has a white middle-class background name. And there are other bits of evidence showing this type of bias as well. The gender bias as well has been shown that females are less likely to be hired. So if you can avoid all that information, like the blind screens put in front of the singers, that can work really well. Clifford Chance showed that as well. Also, in the decision whether to hire somebody, use statistical models, simple regression that is estimated on previous employees' performance, given what we know about their characteristics, like expertise and time with us at work and so on. Or use, if you don't have objective performance, use the prediction of these employees of experienced manager. If you can repeat it several times, this prediction, by asking several managers and take the average. Use the wisdom of crowds. And then when you estimate this model based on the past performance of current employees, use that model to predict the performance of the new candidates, because you already know the objective features, the level of education, the experience in specific clinical area and so on. What was the other question?
I'll ask Sedi and Mustafa to come in a moment briefly, but there's another question up there from Mustafa about, given that prisons are supposed to be rehabilitative, isn't it just a bit deterministic, really, to rely on past data as your guiding light?
It is deterministic, and I'm sure that there's the better ways to make the prediction whether this person is going to reoffend. This is just purely to show that subjective judgment is very biased, because we are inconsistent in in the way that we apply our criteria to make that judgment. We have the right model in our heads, what predicts performance, or what predicts behavior in this case of criminal offenders. But we apply it inconsistently when we talk to the person. Certain features of this person, certain characteristics of the individual I'm chatting to make certain criteria more important, others less so important. And then we don't apply our model consistently. So what we can do, and I mentioned it before, we extract the model, what are the predictors of behavior from experts. As you said, it doesn't need to be the past reoffending. It could be something else. We extract the important predictors from experts, right? And then we use these predictors in our statistical model to predict the likely reoffending in this case. We don't ask the subjective judgments of the interviewers. That's the wisdom from these studies. And there are many, many examples I've shown in the case where actually using intuitive judgment does not work really well. What we need to do is extract the model of what predicts behavior, of what predicts the phenomenon in question from experts, but then don't ask the experts to make the judgment, ask the model to make the judgment and apply it consistently. I cannot overestimate the importance of this finding. It's been repeated in clinical settings, it's been repeated in business settings, it's been repeated in social settings, in personal behavior, and so on. We're very inconsistent in the way we apply criteria in decision making.
So I take it from that you're saying just because you've got a hammer, don't bash everything. You need a whole range of tools and techniques and sources of data and judgment point checks and so forth. Very briefly, because we're right up against it, would either of our questioners like to come in, or are we content to move on? I'm very conscious of the time.
I'm happy to continue.
I'm not sure there's a way of doing it without extending the session, and then we'll be bumping into the next one. I think we need to invite you back for a longer seminar, Ivo. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And I'm sure all of our participants will have learned huge amounts. I know I have. And I'm quite serious. I am going to dig out that book. It's really very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for your work and for what you shared with us today, Ivo.